Yo YouTube, GK's back, and we're doing What Did Those Critics Say? Except this time, it's a throwback, yet kind of a throw forward, Final Fantasy VII. We only have 4 reviews this time, as I think that was more appropriate. We have 2 from 1997, Metacritic, as always, because we gotta get the people's decisions and votes and critiques and all of that. And then we have the most modern review I could find of Final Fantasy VII that was done the most recent in anticipation for the release on March 3rd, 2020, next year. So let's just get into it with IGN. IGN was around in 1997, so that is one of our our most reputable reviews by J. Bohr. To begin, Final Fantasy VII is longer than any console RPG to date. The game takes place across 3 CDs. It took Next Generation Online 49 hours. So they talk about the game size, about how it was really the biggest game out for the time period. 3 discs wasn't unheard of. It is kind of now in current generation. However, it still was the pinnacle of length for an RPG game. They talk about the game's plot. It's deep and typical of Square's prior efforts, quite epic. Basically saying that since it's the 7th installment, they understand that, and Square had already developed a name for itself, being a very deep, plot-driven game. Adult themes and even some uncensored language were all left in place as per Sony's promise not to alter the work. That was really dope, I thought. I never knew that they never wavered in what they wanted to present to even the Western audiences or the Japanese audiences. As we know now, that's not always the case. Games often get changed for localization, and things get lost in translation. That's not to say things didn't get lost in translation for Final Fantasy VII. It's just that it was Sony's promise to make it more adult-like. And that adultness is very much appreciated in 7, because when you look at 9, for example, that wasn't the case. And even so much as I would say 13 as well wasn't as mature as Final Fantasy 7 or Final Fantasy 15-ish. So that's just some of my opinion there. But the game got a 9.5 amazing from IGN back in 1997 on September 3rd. Great score. I love how they still do their taglines like amazing. But a 9.5 is a very strong score, so I suggest you go check out the review. One, because the writing style from back then, it's just nice to see that kind of colloquialism sometimes in writing. We're going to move on now. We're going to go to Metacritic. And dear old Metacritic gave it the same score for the Metascore 92 and the user score of a 9.2. We know those are exactly the same because we do a scale of 100. However, let's look at the overall. 20 positive reviews, no negative and no mixed from the critics. 33 mixed, 15 negative, and 354 positive user reviews. There seems to be a discrepancy here, right? There's 0 and 0 on one side, and then there's 33 and 15 on the other. So we have to look at why this difference may occur and kind of analyze that. So let's look at some good reviews first from the critic side. Thunderbolt. Without a doubt, Final Fantasy VII is one of the top Final Fantasy games out there. It is also one of the best RPG adventures of all time. Absolute PlayStation said, this is the current apex in RPG games. In fact, it is probably one of the best overall games ever created for any system. That's a very high praise, and remember, Metacritic did not exist when Final Fantasy VII came out, so that is all done in retrospect. That retrospection is going to come up with these next 2 user reviews that were negative and mixed. Let's go with Hannah L. first. This game is boring, graphics are horrible, and they could have done better. I wouldn't be so angry if that was the best they can do. Hannah L. Might be what we call a troll. And specifically, if you remember our previous video with Kingdom Hearts, we had an actual reviewer who gets paid to do reviews actually admit that he wrote a bad review only for the clicks. In 2006, I cannot help but feel Hannah L. did the same thing. To say the game is boring is just not true. It may be boring to you, but if you're going to write a review per se. The point is to be somewhat objective. So the graphics are horrible is totally incorrect, because in 1997 the graphics were literally the best thing people had ever seen on a console or in general the gaming world. It was crazy. So Hannah, you're just a troll, and I can't even really bother with any more on that, because it's just, if you're not going to try a little bit to be objective, I can't help you, Hannah. All right, so now Dr. Zach, dated and overrated. Final Fantasy VII gets a 7 out of 10. It's not a bad game, and it's not a bad story, but there are obvious flaws about this game. If you just look at a lot of the positive scores, they're without any merit. I cannot, in modern era of gaming, recommend the original game or any of its ports. Again, Dr. Zach, September 10th, 2017. Okay, almost 20 years. Actually, 20 years since the game's first release. To say the game is dated and overrated can be a decent critique, right? Because if you feel that the game is only a 7 out of 10, which can be a valid score, I'm not saying yes or no to that. That could be fine. But dated, by looking 20 years back, it's going to look dated, especially when we're going 4K HD or PS4 Pros. It's going to have that feel. But to say you can't recommend it is a bit of a shortcoming on this little review blurb here, because the original, there is something to play original games. People love to play original games, and unfortunately in 2017 and in 2006, the game was probably spoiled for you without even touching most of the social media that really came post 2006. The game would have been spoiled for you in some sort of way. But the real funny thing here, and the really pretentious part, if you look at a lot of the positive scores, they're without any sort of merit. I'm not sure what he means by that. It sounds like Dr. Zach thinks he himself, or she, is with all of the merit, and nobody else has any type of merit to say what they say about the game. Dr. Zach, that's just really, really stupid to say. Sorry, you again fall in the troll category with Hannah. The game does have flaws. I'm not saying it's a perfect game. I'm just saying when you bring a review or critique to the forefront and you aren't objective about it, and you clearly think yourself better than the game, the object you're reviewing, that's when in your writing it starts to show. And it can become really standoffish and really niche and really show your true intentions. Just like the reviewer who did the Kingdom Hearts review way back in the day. We're going to move on now, though, to GameStop. Yes, GameStop was around in 1997, and they wrote a review for Final Fantasy VII. And Greg Kasavine, September 29th, 1997, a little later than our previous reviewer, about a little more than 20 days even, so they spent a lot of time with it, so I'm going to actually take a lot from this GameStop review. At the same time, Final Fantasy VII is considerably more challenging than its original release. You actually must plan ahead and devise some sort of strategy to best some of the monsters. Other changes include the addition of spectacular all-new cinematics and a handful of intriguing new plot sequences at key points. So what they're talking about is a port. Maybe not the original release of the game. They're talking about one of its iterations that came out fairly quickly, I'm assuming for Western audiences. However, it's still a review from the time, so I thought it important to mention. And they also have the benefit here of mentioning other reviewers. Some have gone as far as to call Final Fantasy VII the hands-down best game ever made. And if you enjoy a good RPG, Japanese RPG, chances are you will agree. However, Final Fantasy VII, for all its astonishing features, is not a game with a sort of mass appeal that its mass marketing blitz may lead you to believe. For one thing, you can't finish it in a sitting, as Final Fantasy VII will be a solid 40 to 50 hours. They're kind of talking about here that past Final Fantasies you may have been able to beat one sitting. One sitting can be anywhere really from 4 to 12 hours, if you know what I mean, gamers. So that's a huge deviation from some of the previous iterations. However, I have always been thought that and led to believe that Final Fantasy has always been a game you are spending some time with, and you don't necessarily want to blitz through. So they're kind of commenting on that. It's a little shot at the it's not a game for everyone kind of thing, even though looking back it was and is still, hence the remake of the game coming out next year. So they kind of got that wrong. Camera angles as the catastrophe unfolds. Meanwhile, a masterfully orchestrated soundtrack of Nobu Uematsu. That's really cool. They mentioned the soundtrack this time. I think some of the other reviews did, but this here really puts an emphasis on it, and it is true. It was a great soundtrack, one of the most known in the whole franchise. Final Fantasy VII is not without its shortcomings and occasional design problems. These are enough to make some gamers who are unfamiliar with RPGs, to be sure, wonder why just anyone would bother playing through it in the first place. Here they're trying to appeal to the other genres, and they're trying to say that if you're new to RPGs, you might not understand why these designs and these shots and camera angles are there. That's because you're really not used to a story. You're not used to real storytelling in your game. And that's what Final Fantasy VII did in polygons, right? Polygons, huge deal. Rendered cinematics, huge deal. And that was a shock to a lot of people who were point and clicker, one polygon type of gamers. So I can see how that could have been a thing. Will that play into the overall score? I'm not so sure yet. Never before have technology, playability, and narrative combined as well as in Final Fantasy VII. The culmination of Squaresoft's monumental effort. That was just to say that this was never done before, and it really was crazy what they did. Mind you, it wasn't Square Enix, it was Squaresoft back then. Some might say that there's a real huge difference between the two. So the final score it got was another 9.5. So both of our reviews from 1997 gave the game a 9.5. That's very interesting. Now, Nintendo Life. I don't know much about Nintendo Life, and I'm not the biggest Nintendo fan. However, they have written the most recent review for Final Fantasy VII. And Mitch Vogel writes, better late than never. Yeah, I guess it's better late than never. Very recent, as you saw the date. And we'll just kind of get into some of his quotes here. He said, Final Fantasy VII. It's still all too common to lose track of exactly what your character can or can't interact with on any given screen. There's a reason that pre-rendered backgrounds have been left firmly in the past for video games, and Final Fantasy VII stands as an example why. I read his essay, obviously, and he really sounds I use this word a lot, pretentious, because it's such a good word and it develops so many types of ideas. But yes, clearly pre-rendered backgrounds are in the past, but for the time in which you are writing the review about a game over 20 years old at this point, you should have kind of said that was a big deal. Maybe not amazing, maybe not crazy, just that it was a big deal to have. And yeah, there are shortcomings with that, but the upside of having those rendered backgrounds is such a huge positive that it outweighs the negatives, especially since the time frame and the time period that Final Fantasy VII came out. For those of you that wish to play the game as it was designed, there's plenty of depth to the materia system that governs character growth. Eschewing the popular job systems of the past, Final Fantasy VII makes all of its characters basically classless, with equipable materia. Talking about the mechanics of the actual game and how it changed from Black Mage Warrior to physical characters who have their own traits that kind of can be whatever you want depending on the materia you equipped. Though Final Fantasy VII is notoriously linear compared to some past entries, it still remains unabashedly an old-school Final Fantasy game with random encounters, turn-based battles, and the ATB system all being par for the course here. As one would expect, the random encounter rate is tediously overbearing in many portions, but it can be helpfully offset by a modern feature Square worked into the re-release, in which clicking down the left stick triples the speed of the whole game, turning those glacial repetitive encounters against mook enemies into blink and you miss it blitzkriegs. Now, I'm all for gamers playing games. However, functionality like that, when you're not using it for speed running, to me defeats the purpose of playing a game, just like the idea of having a skip a boss button. If you remember that from Cuphead, it really defeats the purpose, really, when you can just turn on triple the speed. And saying that the battles are tediously overbearing, again, you kind of miss the point of a Final Fantasy game, especially looking back on Final Fantasy VII and then the more recent entries, at how RPG they are. You're supposed to play a role and you're really supposed to spend time and level up. And I can see this gamer really getting stuck in some spots because they're just underleveled. The release of Final Fantasy VII in 1997 was a watershed moment for both Square and the role-playing game genre as a whole, forever changing the status quo moving forward. So that's cool. He at least acknowledges the fact that the game changed the landscape for RPGs. But the conclusion, an 8 out of 10, we're going to read the whole conclusion. Final Fantasy VII is the sort of game that speaks for itself, a touchstone of game design that played a large role in setting the standard for RPGs for years to come. It goes without saying that you should give Final Fantasy VII a shot if you consider yourself to be a fan of RPGs, as this is an experience unlike any other in many ways. With that being said, it's also the sort of thing that has since been surpassed in almost every manner by games that took the concept introduced and expanded upon them in plenty of new and more interesting ways. Final Fantasy VII is a relic of its time, but that doesn't mean it's to be respected any less. If you can look past the obviously antiquated elements, this is a well-paced, engaging RPG that's still fun to play today. It's more than worthy of your time. This conclusion really doesn't sum up how I felt he was acting and writing in his review. He kind of sugarcoated it at the end here, but still only gave the game an 8 out of 10. 8 out of 10 is still a very, good score. But when doing something so retrospective, yes, a lot of aspects have been surpassed through the years. But if you've played Final Fantasy VII, whether back then or recently, there are still elements in that game that haven't been surpassed because they were that good. And that's kind of what I wanted to touch on with the Nintendo Life review. And also, it's the most recent. So we have our 4 reviews. We're going to do some quick math this time. I know we usually do 5, and I'll be right back. So we took up our scores. It's 4 scores. It may look like 5 because we take the 2 Metacritic scores, average them together to get 1 score. Take all our numbers, simple math here, add them all together, divide by how many actual reviewers there were, and we get our score out of 100. Obviously, all the single-digit numbers get bumped up to 100, a scale, and that simple math, go check it out in my other videos. I explain it in a little more detail. But do I think a 90.5 as a final score is a little low? Yeah, I do think it's a little low, even though it's still an A or a 9 out of 10, because a lot of review sites won't do the point system like 9.5, but however, some do. That 8 from Nintendo Life really brought it down, and his review really didn't portray, or at least I didn't portray, his cynicism for the game. I don't know if that's the right word there, but and he tried to cover it up, I think. And then the 2 9.5s, I think, were right on the money from the time period from 1997. So I lend a lot of credence to those. And then, of course, Metacritic. I think Metacritic's 92 really falls perfectly in line, and I think the game really falls at like a 93, a 94 if we were going to take a true average. But that 8 from Nintendo Life was just too low and therefore brought our average down by law of averages. That's just what's going to happen. You get one bad score, it really kills you. But it's still worth its weight in gold, if you get the saying, and I really recommend Final Fantasy's original game to anybody who wants to get into RPGs, or if you've never played Final Fantasy VII. There's a lot of nuance in the game that still can translate over till today, and I'm sure it was spoiled for you, but I'm sure there's many little things that weren't spoiled for you, and it is those little things that are really going to get expanded upon in the remaster. It's been talked about. I'm not really going to do a video on the new stuff for Final Fantasy VII, but those little niche things that people don't really talk about, they're going to be huge plot points, most definitely, in the new remaster. So I'm really excited for that. But to round out the video, 90.5 is just too low for Final Fantasy VII. Maybe I'll create like a stamp. Low, high, and perfect. I don't know. We'll see. But that was the review. All the reviews are very well written, even though you got to take into account personal taste and writing style with that. And I didn't necessarily like some of the reviews, especially the people who just trolled to get clicks on their review, especially those from Metacritic. Those were just trolls, and you can have those opinions. Just make sure you back your opinions up with some fact and some objectivity. If you want to write it in an opinion column, that's different than a review. So always keep that in mind when you're checking out reviews. And that's it. For right now, Final Fantasy VII's original review is just a little too low, even though the score is amazing, 90.5. It's just a great game. That's all from me today. Later today, we'll have the demo again. We're going to do some Final Fantasy 15 novella stuff. You guys know I'm big on the novella stuff. Probably make a series out of that like we did with the Final Fantasy 10 novella. I will see you a little later. Oh, and real quick, this is post-edit. If you could maybe sub, maybe give a like, I'd really, really appreciate it. My goal really is just to get to 10 subs. That'd be really, really awesome. That's really it. And if you like the content, or you want to get a game reviewed that maybe you played and maybe I didn't, I usually do games I played, but I do all types of games. Yeah, so just let me know. We'll definitely do some more Final Fantasy ones, as I think those are really interesting, especially the ones from the past looking forward. And that's really it. Check back later today. We'll have some more content for you.